Germany's most trusted fintech company was missing $1.9 billion in cash. Not stolen, not misplaced. It simply never existed. A quarter of the entire balance sheet fabricated. And for a decade, the auditors signed off on it every single year. But here's the part that should haunt you. Germany's financial regulator, the agency whose entire purpose was to catch something like this, was not investigating Wirecard. It was investigating the journalist who said Wirecard was lying. Wirecard was in the DAX 30, the 30 most prestigious companies in Germany, the index that stands alongside the Dow Jones and the FTSE 100 as a global symbol of institutional trust. This company filed for bankruptcy in 4 days, $22.5 billion in market value, 7,000 employees, 50 countries, a company that briefed German government ministers and called itself the future of European finance. And when a reporter at the Financial Times started asking the obvious questions, Germany's watchdog filed a criminal complaint against the reporter. This is the story of how every institution that was supposed to protect you ended up protecting the fraud instead. One reasonable decision at a time. To understand how this was possible, you have to go back to where it started. Munich, January 1999. The dot-com bubble is inflating by the hour. A small company registers in Aschheim, a suburb east of the city, with a straightforward purpose: process credit card payments online. The clients nobody else wanted: adult content sites, online gambling platforms, the merchants that mainstream banks wouldn't touch. The company is called Wirecard, and for the first 3 years, it nearly goes under. Then, in 2002, an Austrian named Markus Braun arrives. He holds a PhD in social and economic sciences, spent years at KPMG, and has the particular confidence of a consultant who has read every playbook and decided he can beat them all. He injects capital into a company on the edge of collapse. He becomes CEO, and he begins to transform what was essentially a billing pipe for the internet's seedier corners into something with a bolder identity: Germany's answer to PayPal. Braun has a gift. He can articulate a vision of financial infrastructure, a platform that makes global commerce seamless, that makes investors believe they are witnessing the birth of something important. He is rarely specific about how the numbers add up, but specifics seem beside the point when the story is this compelling. Wirecard lists on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. It survives the crash. It acquires its way into banking licenses, into Asia, into the payment stack of merchants across Europe. And by the mid-2010s, it is being compared to the great American fintech giants. Germany, at last, has its own champion. The fintech was real. The payments infrastructure existed. Millions of transactions moved through its systems every day. That is what made what came next so difficult to see, because the truth was hiding inside something that was genuinely working. But that story was already hiding a pattern, and some people could see it. By 2008, Wirecard had survived the dot-com crash and was growing fast. But small, persistent questions had started to appear at the edges. Anonymous short sellers on financial message boards noted that its Asian revenues looked strange, that the profit margins from third-party payment partners in obscure jurisdictions were unusually high, that some of the acquisitions didn't add up. Wirecard's response to every question was the same: lawsuits, character attacks, surveillance. The company hired private investigators. It tracked journalists. It pressured critics into silence. And when a London-based research firm called Zatara published a detailed report in 2016 accusing Wirecard of money laundering and accounting fraud, its stock dropped sharply. What happened next tells you everything. BaFin, Germany's financial regulator, the equivalent of the Securities and Exchange Commission, opened an investigation, not into Wirecard's accounts, into the short sellers who had published the report. The investigation was framed as potential market manipulation. The underlying fraud allegations were not pursued. Wirecard's stock recovered. The Zatara researchers were pressured. The pattern was set. Raise your hand, and the system would come for you. This happened not once, but repeatedly. In 2016, EY's own auditors raised significant concerns during the Wirecard audit. They considered refusing to issue a clean opinion. Then they signed off anyway. At each of these moments, the question was, why did the institutions keep choosing to look the other way? The answer, which took years to fully understand, was that Wirecard had become something Germany couldn't afford to disbelieve. By 2018, Wirecard had fully transformed itself into something remarkable in the German imagination. In September of that year, on the 24th, Deutsche Börse made it official. Wirecard would join the DAX 30, replacing Commerzbank, one of Germany's oldest banks. The announcement was celebrated as a landmark. Germany's fintech sector had arrived. The country that had struggled to produce tech giants was now home to a European payments champion, valued at $22.5 billion. This was the moment the fraud became almost untouchable. Because to say Wirecard was a fraud now was to say Germany had made a catastrophic mistake, and that was too uncomfortable for almost anyone to say out loud. But read the fine print. A significant portion of Wirecard's profits came from what the company called its third-party acquirer model. In regions where Wirecard lacked local banking licenses, particularly across Asia and the Middle East, it claimed to partner with small local payment processors called third-party acquirers, or TPAs. These TPAs handled local card transactions. They sent fees back to Wirecard, and the accumulated profits from this arrangement were held, so Wirecard said, in trust accounts in Singapore and the Philippines. $1.9 billion in trust accounts, managed by independent trustees, overseen by auditors. Except EY had never gone directly to the banks to confirm the money was there. Instead, for years, they accepted documents provided by trustees, documents that, it would later turn out, were fabricated. The fine print was always there. No one read it. And that is where the story of Dan McCrum begins. McCrum is a financial journalist at the Financial Times who received a tip in the summer of 2014 from a hedge fund manager named John Hempton. The tip was simple. Something about Wirecard's Asian business doesn't add up. McCrum started digging. He published early pieces in 2015 raising questions about Wirecard's accounting. Wirecard denied everything and went on the attack. The FT's own editors were skeptical. McCrum was told to be careful. Then, on 30 January 2019, the FT published the investigation that changed everything. Based on 70 gigabytes of leaked internal emails and documents from a former Wirecard lawyer, the story alleged that managers in Singapore had forged contracts and backdated documents to inflate the company's profits. Wirecard's stock dropped more than 30% in a single day, and then Germany's financial watchdog, BaFin, acted. On 18th of February 2019, it imposed a 2-month ban on building new short positions in Wirecard, the first time it had ever done this for a single company. On 10th of April 2019, it filed a criminal complaint against Dan McCrum and his colleague Stefania Palma, alleging they were colluding with short sellers to manipulate the market. Wirecard hired private investigators to surveil McCrum. It mounted a legal campaign against the FT. Its stock recovered. By August 2019, it was trading above 150. The regulatory machine had spoken. The journalist was the problem. Wirecard was Germany's champion, and the system would protect it. Think for a moment about what it means to be a journalist under criminal investigation by your own country's financial regulator for accurately reporting that a company is committing fraud. Dan McCrum did not stop. He kept working. He kept publishing. Because he had something the system didn't, 70 gigabytes of the company's own documents. In April 2020, KPMG published a special audit of Wirecard, commissioned by Wirecard itself, to try to silence the critics. The report landed like a bomb in the wrong direction. KPMG said it could not verify approximately $1 billion in foreign bank account balances linked to a Singapore trustee. The trustee had cut ties with Wirecard right as the audit began. The $1.9 billion story was becoming impossible to explain. And then came June 2020. Wirecard had already delayed publishing its 2019 annual accounts 3 times. EY, the auditor that had signed off on a decade of Wirecard's books, finally decided to do something it should have done years earlier. It contacted the banks directly. On the other end of the line were 2 Philippine banks, BDO Unibank and Bank of the Philippine Islands. EY asked them to confirm that Wirecard held $1.9 billion in trust accounts at their institutions. BDO replied that the documents were spurious. BPI replied that the signature on its supposed confirmation letter was forged. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, the Philippine Central Bank, issued a public statement. The money, quote, had never entered the Philippine financial system. On 18th of June 2020, EY refused to sign Wirecard's 2019 accounts. Wirecard stock fell 60% in a single day. McCrum was at his desk when the statement came through. He had spent 6 years being investigated, surveilled, taken to court, and called a criminal. He had been right all along. The $1.9 billion did not exist. It had never existed. It was a number on a spreadsheet, backed by documents that no one with power had bothered to verify. Germany's financial watchdog had known about the allegations since at least 2016. It had filed a criminal complaint against the journalist instead. 7 days after EY's refusal, on 25th of June 2020, Wirecard filed for insolvency at Munich's district court. It listed debts of nearly $3.9 billion. In a single month, Germany had watched the first DAX 30 member in history go bankrupt. Markus Braun was arrested. He would later face trial on charges of fraud, market manipulation, and embezzlement. The proceedings are ongoing in Munich, but the story's most extraordinary figure had already vanished. Jan Marsalek was Wirecard's chief operating officer. He was the one who ran the Asian operations. He was the one who managed the third-party acquirers, the trust accounts, the whole architecture of the fraud. On 19th June 2020, he was dismissed. 3 days later, he was gone. Marsalek flew to Belarus, then to Moscow, and Western intelligence services began to piece together something far stranger than a corporate fraud. Marsalek had been a Russian intelligence asset for years before the collapse, linked, investigators now believe, to the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency. He had been running intelligence operations across Europe while simultaneously running one of Germany's most celebrated companies. In March 2025, a London court convicted 6 Bulgarian nationals of espionage for Russia. Marsalek was named as the ringleader who directed their operations from Moscow. Austria, where Marsalek held citizenship, announced in October 2025 that it was considering stripping him of his passport. He is still there, in Moscow, under Russian protection, wanted by Interpol, never charged. Now for the acidic beat. In April 2023, Germany's audit watchdog, APs, fined Ernst & Young $500,000 and handed it a 2-year ban from auditing public interest companies in Germany. That is the price of a decade of signing off on a balance sheet that was roughly a quarter fictitious. The criminal investigation into Dan McCrum was quietly dropped after Wirecard's collapse. German prosecutors said his reporting was, and this is the exact wording, fundamentally accurate. BaFin's own president had called Wirecard a complete disaster. The regulator that filed a criminal complaint against the journalist had also failed to file one against the company, until 5 days before its insolvency. It's tempting to call this a story about a few greedy men, but that's too easy. Wirecard was not exposed by Germany's regulators. It was not caught by its auditors. It was not flagged by the banks that lent it billions. It was not stopped by the analysts who held buy ratings while its stock climbed past 100, past 150, past 190. It was exposed by a journalist, one man, working under criminal complaint, being surveilled, publishing anyway. The question is not whether fraud happens. The question is why the system was more effective at protecting the fraud than stopping it. Why every institution that touched Wirecard chose, at the critical moment, to look away. And why the one person who didn't look away was the one the system tried to destroy. Jan Marsalek is still in Moscow. The $1.9 billion is still missing, because it was never there. Markus Braun is on trial in Munich. EY paid a fine that amounted to a few days of revenue. BaFin got new powers. The world moved on. But the structure that made Wirecard possible, third-party acquirers, opaque jurisdictions, trust accounts no one verifies, is still the foundation of the embedded finance industry in 2026. The same model, differently named, read the fine print.